I think welfare is the biggest crisis in Britain today. It's behind low economic growth, it's behind poverty, and it needs to be fixed from a progressive point of view.
If we look at the sums, they need 4.7 billion for defence. That was one of Keir Starmer's legacies. They need, I think I've counted about 2 billion of the 4 billion of pledges that Burnham has made alone so far look unfunded to me. So that money's got to come from somewhere. And that's with no sign of the Strait of Hormuz opening, continuing conflict in the Middle East. The problems and the financial pressures are piling up, Gabriel.
I don't think it's fair to say that all politicians have espoused the same message. We actually live in a time where there is a sort of marked distinction between what, say, Reform and Labour and the Tories are proposing. But there is an extent to which the successive governments have all alighted on this sweet spot, which is that people feel they want control restored to their lives. They want control over their finances, and people want control within their communities. And Burnham's basically saying to people, this time I've actually got the secret sauce to give you a greater actual autonomy over your postcode. He talks about good growth in every postcode, greater and also greater perceived ownership as well. And has just a really straightforward question, which is, will the fact and the policy reality be commensurate with the rhetoric? Because the rhetoric is pretty soaring at the moment. And also, I mean, this is the essential question. It's so, I feel like an under-remarked upon, under-examined question. What exactly is it about this that will be distinct from the misadventures in devolution that have defined the Welsh and Scottish experiments over the last 30 years? I wouldn't say that he's been as forthcoming about that.
We expect him to talk today about public control. One of the big messages, they've taken public control of a relatively small local bus company. But Andy Burnham's bigger point is public control over the kind of everyday essentials, as he calls it. The big one on the horizon is Thames Water. And I think it is more complicated when you get to things like that because, okay, let's take Thames Water. You take that into special administration, which is something successive governments, it's a badly run company, it's too big, it doesn't serve people's interests well, that's fine. But once you get it into special administration, how do you get it back out again? The taxpayer subsidies to keep it operating would be huge. And then on top of that, you'd still have to keep paying all these executives quite chunky sums of money and bonuses to keep them on board. So it's not straightforward. And then who would the private buyer for a distressed asset be at the end of it? So that's one of the challenges here, that actually it's the gap between the ideas and the complexity of the reality, which I think we'll see in the autumn.
But I suppose that Andy Burnham is a man who needs to give a narrative right now. And he's the mayor who believes in giving power to local authorities. So, whether it works or not, it kind of sounds coherent. So he can say, look, if you dislike government, it's actually Westminster you dislike. And I intend to disempower what you don't like, which is government. So he wants to put a little rebel yell behind his devolution. So if he wants to be seen to be somebody who's making a big change, I think that's the big test for Andy Burnham. If you're fed up with a Labour government, if you're fed up with the way things are going, you want to believe somebody's coming along who's going to make a big change. And if he's saying, look, I'm going to completely redo the way government is done, I'm going to give power to the regions, it may or may not work, but at least it sounds like a change. So politically, I think it meets a lot of the tests he's got for himself. Whether it'll work in practice, well, ask anybody in Wales and Scotland.
Look, voters will need to see evidence of the change. And that brings us to the third topic in an absolutely terrible segue. Fraser, you have written the book on this. You spend an inordinate amount of your time buried deep in the welfare statistics on the government websites and elsewhere. But just very briefly, just to tee it up, we've got two big reviews which are coming at the same time. The Alan Milburn review into welfare, and he's looking at NEETs, so young people that are not in education, training or employment. And then on top of that, you've got a Stephen Timms review into PIP, which is the main disability benefit. So those are the two reviews. And at the end of it, Andy Burnham has talked a good game. He said he wants to cut the welfare bill. He said we shouldn't be squeamish about it. But what he said he's opposed to is crude cuts. Alan Milburn's interim report said that for every £25 spent on benefits, £1 is spent on employment support, right? And that is obviously an insane disparity. But to address that disparity, you can't just chuck money at the employment to level it up to 25. There are going to be winners and losers. And that is the difficult bit for Labour. That's the difficult bit for Burnham. Does he have the political will to address potential losers in the system?
I'm quite optimistic about his chances of getting this right, and I'll tell you why. The first is that he saw what failure looks like. He saw Keir Starmer thinking, look, a huge majority here, I can reform welfare. It was a debacle because he didn't have a narrative. You need to be able to say to people, look, this is tough love for a purpose. I'm going to take away this, it's going to hurt, but you and your community are going to be better off because of X, Y, and Z. I think that Andy Burnham has looked at this and he's realised, no, we need to start with the bigger picture, the bigger story. Now that, of course, to Starmer's credit, is why he commissioned Alan Milburn, why Pat McFadden's there and still in office, why Stephen Sims is there, so they can come up with the normal political narrative. First of all, to explain the nature of the crisis. I think welfare is the biggest crisis in Britain today. It's behind low economic growth, it's behind poverty, and it needs to be fixed from a progressive point of view. And I also think that Milburn has done something quite incredible. He's managed to bring all parties with him. So when his interim review came out, it wasn't a kind of, this is a Labour review to say how evil the Tories are. It was, look, we've all, as a country, we have got this NEETs problem we can all agree needs to be fixed. So I think we are heading towards a very rare historical moment where we could be able to get cross-party belief in welfare reform. And I can see the potential for a cross-party, but is needed because, of course, it's difficult for one person to make reforms while being accused of being cruel by the other person. They need to almost do disarmament, as it were. And I do think that Andy Burnham, if you look at what he's done in Manchester, he was very good at working out the need for vocational education, of trying to integrate what he called the Manchester Baccalaureate, trying to get people in work experience. He was also coming up against Bridget Phillipson wanting to centralise those things. So I think he gets it. I think he's going to want Burnham to go quite far. We use Burnham as cover. And I think the Conservatives realise that they need to support this too. And surprisingly, Reform have been first out of the gates with their quite dramatic proposals for cutting disability allowances. So we could be heading for a moment here where there is a solution that it could work. It will be painful. I don't think it will save masses of money. But I think we've been crying out for it for many, many years. And I'm hopeful we'll get it before Christmas.
It's a tough sell with Labour MPs, though, Gabriel. They are a tough crowd on this, right?
I think if you look at the sort of mood music of the first, say, couple of months of Burnhamism, what has he prioritised in his messaging and language? Well, firstly, he has solidified publicly Labour's support to its, the bits of the electorate to Labour's left flank. And then within the Parliamentary Labour Party too, his whole leadership pitch was designed to bring back that kind of kingmaker coalition of the dispossessed, disgruntled, soft lefties. Burnham now has the quite unenviable, kind of complicated, fascinating task of saying to them, well, having given you a lot of love now, you need to come with me and accept that for us to survive and thrive, I need to make decisions that are difficult. They're going to be difficult for you in your constituency surgeries. And the essential question is, can Andy Burnham find a language that allows these people to rebut those claims as well? Because what it really felt like last time was because there was so little argumentation and forethought that went into, say, the winter fuel or benefits reform. I think that you've said there's cross-party support, but that doesn't mean that anybody is deluding themselves it's going to be straightforward. And, we were talking about early releases and the extent to which every single data point and case study is a person's life and universe, or, every single instance of something happening becomes an emotionally unignorable and devastating example of the effect of this. It will be not dissimilar where you look at people whose lives are wholly contingent, or they perceive them to be dependent on the existing flow of money and support from the state. What is Andy Burnham's rejoinder to them? You can't ignore it. So how do you deal with it? How does the Labour Party deal with it? That is kind of one of the big essay questions for the budget and for welfare reform when it inevitably comes.
And that essay question is, what is the Labour Party for? What does it mean to be progressive? The clue is in the name. Let's go back to Keir Hardie. Let's look at the whole purpose of working. If this party believes that work should be a way out of poverty, it needs to repair the economy, so it is. So I think it's actually, in some ways, it's a difficult argument to make because difficult reforms. In other ways, it ought to be easy. This should be in the soul of every single progressive MP. They can blame the Tories as much as they like. But if you've got a situation right now where we've got the highest number of NEETs of any European country apart from Romania, if you've got a situation where we're breeding now a new form of poverty, a new inequality, and you can see it in the drugs deaths, from the alcohol deaths, you can see it in the welfare ghettos that we're kind of creating unintentionally, this is not a progressive outcome. This will be, to me, the biggest test of Andy Burnham, but I also believe he can do it. He's a good storyteller, we know that. But, I think this is wrongly diminished storytelling. I've always thought about politics as ultimately as making and winning arguments. And if he can do that with his own party, he could be an historic change-making prime minister. And perhaps this is something you could even fight an election on. It'd be difficult, but this is the challenge.